You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. I'm back today with another curious discovery. A work by the little-known author Harold Standish Corbin called The Thing in the Tree, first published in the February 1927 issue of Ghost Stories. What influence could make a tree take on human characteristics? I hope you enjoy this one. The Thing in the Tree by Harold Standish Corbin. 1. As I look back on that black night, I wonder whether the ancient druids who venerated the oak and believed the mistletoe that clung to it emblematical of man's dependence on deity did not hold in their philosophy more knowledge of the forces of nature than we moderns are aware of. For it was a tree, and the thing that was in the tree was what did for poor Craig, turned him into a gruesome, hideous abomination, and then killed him. Even now I awake in the night, suffocated, paralyzed with fear as that terrifying memory returns to me. Craig, suspended there between heaven and earth, then that awful cry that escaped his lips. Craig, who was my friend and one of the finest chaps you ever could meet, turned into a loathsome, hideous thing. To me, nature no longer holds her charms. Were I to tread a forest now, I would constantly search the sylvan glades for that strange contention that is taking place in nature always. The woodmouse's squeak to me would portend the coming of doom to the tiny creature. I could not look upon the beautiful blending of colors on the serpent's back, or the meticulous geometric design, without thinking of his stabbing fangs filled with venom. And each beautiful flower would send me away shivering, lest accompanying its beauty I might find some deadly miasmic effluvia that would scorch and blast. Perhaps in time I shall gain control of myself again. But now I'm afraid of the shadows that creep and recede in the dark places, and often I stop muscle-fast at the illusion from out the corner of my eye of some dread thing having moved or flicked itself around the corner. Of an evening, as I sit reading, I turn the lights brightly, so that I may observe every crack and cranny of the room. And I would not go into the darkness of the adjoining room for all the wealth of India. Such is the terror that has seized me since I saw Craig die, dying as he did between heaven and earth, or hell and earth, if you please, for no other man died exactly as he did. So, in the hope that I may rid myself of this fear by holding it within me no longer, but may spread it in the clean sunlight of public knowledge, let me tell you my story. There is, in the northern part of the state of Connecticut, a rocky chasm that has been named by the natives there Cat Rocks. It is a wild and rugged place, where bear formerly found sanctuary, and its name is taken from the fact that for many years a great wild cat had its den in the chasm, preying upon the farmer's fowl and young stock, and avoiding for a long time the righteous wrath of the landholders, and the rifle bullet that at last ended its nefarious career. Standing at the brink, one may imagine the terrific straining and rending of the earth in travail, as the chasm and its rocky sides were formed. Hard by the chasm are scattered farms, rocky, hilly, poor, whose soil has become as beggarly as the generations of men and women that have worked them. Many of them now are abandoned by the newer generations who have become tired of a hand-to-mouth existence and have drifted away to the wealth and excitement of the cities. It was such a farm that John Crandall occupied there. Crandall was intriguing. He lived the life of a recluse. He was a short, thick-set, dark man who rarely spoke about himself, and the little we knew of him was that he seemed to have enough of this world's goods to remain at ease when he liked, browsing in the queer collection of books he had accumulated in that strange house of his, filled with antiques. But he was a good host to us when we visited him in the hunting season. Cat Rocks was one of the last stands of what game there is left in Connecticut, and because of its out-of-the-way location, has been a stronghold against the encroachments of civilization and the flivver. Craig himself had introduced us to Crandall. There were in the group, besides Craig, who was a lawyer, Stewart, the banker, Batchelder, the merchant, and myself, a newspaperman, all pals together and friends of long standing. The hunting that season had been fair, but the day of the tragedy was overcast. One of those grey autumn days with an east wind blowing from the sea not so many miles away. It chilled one to the very marrow of one's bones. Dead leaves whirled in spirals, and gusts of wind like the sudden rush of chilling, unseen spirits swept over us. With the coming of night, we trailed in from the woods to Crandall's home, and after a hot, delicious supper cooked by our host, we seated ourselves around the great fireplace in the old farmhouse, pipes aglow, and our tired bodies warmly lazy. As is the way with Americans these days, our conversation drifted to prohibition and the concoctions of other times. Each had recalled some favorite drink, when our host, who had had little part in our talk, broke in, "There is a way of making apple toddy that few of the later-day saints ever knew," he said. "Golden russet cider, a dash of sherry, the crab apples bobbing on its brown bosom, and then a poker heated to cherry red to plunge into its midst that it may sizzle and seethe until hot. Ah, that is a toddy worthy of a gentleman's compliment." We applauded that, and laughingly called upon him to produce, but he held up his hand. "There is another," he said, "a cider so mysterious, so potent, so insidious that I would not have you drink of it. For he who drinks it is like to go stark, raving mad." This pronouncement only served to whet our interest. We were four logical, candid persons, and naturally we were skeptical as to any drink of cider being potent enough to put us into the condition mentioned. "What is this cider you mention that has such dire possibilities?" said Craig banteringly. "What is there so different about this particular cider?" "A liquid so palely golden, so smooth, that it is artful and sly. I tell you, by the gods, one drink of it will send you stark raving mad. Let's say no more about it." "You're crazy," said Craig. "I've tasted the wines of France and Italy, the Sauternes, Burgundies, Clarets, Chiantis, and the whole lot of them, and I've not gone mad yet. What kind of juice is this?" "You have never tasted the juice of Gayar's russet," replied Crandall quietly. "Gayar's russet?" Craig scoffed. The argument seemed likely to wax as hot as the heat of the logs around which we toasted our shins. Crandall apparently wished to change the subject. Craig insisted. He desired to know for himself. I thought Crandall baited him. Craig finally demanded a sip of the liquor in question. The warmth of the fire had begun to sink into our chilled frames, and we were comfortably amused. Craig's demands became louder. Crandall hesitated. Then, as though debating still, he reached above his head and took from among the antiques variously suspended on wall and ceiling an ancient lanthorn, and opened its battered side to light the candle within. For a second, the candle sputtered protestingly as though it resisted the journey on which it was bound, then broke into a pale, yellow flame when the door of it was closed. "Come," said the host, a note of crafty eagerness arising in his voice. "Watch out for the cobwebs on the cellar stair." He laughed harshly. "Cobwebs," he continued, "sometimes give one the peculiar sensation when drifting across the face of cold, clammy hands of the dead that reach out to ensnare and seize one from the dark." "You needn't be so ghastly about the thing," muttered Batchelder. The wind howled mournfully outside, and the shutters rattled and boards creaked in distant parts of the house. Crandall apologized, but informed us he could not bring the cider to the room in which we sat. "Drink it in the cellar, if you must drink it at all," he commanded. Again there rose that note, or was I imagining it, of eagerness in his voice. He continued, "I will not have you mad up here. Strong walls surround the cellar. I may have to chain one of you there for the night, until the power of the beverage passes." "Mildly interesting," laughed Craig, but there was a creepy feeling down my spine that I did not particularly enjoy. We turned to follow the lead of Crandall, for none of us grown men would so much as permit another to think our host's croakings caused us any alarm. Down the dark, uneven stairs we trooped, Crandall leading with a lanthorn, giving none too good a light, our feet stumbling, our bodies bumping against stones that must have been there for ages. Cobwebs entangled us with ghostly clutchings, drooling across our faces like clammy things from some other realm. Water dripped noisily, and there were many scurryings in the half-darkness. Shadows danced, receded, and sprang forward with lean fingers to grasp and tear at our bodies. Craig struck his head against a low beam and fell backward upon us. Almost in concert we cursed. At last, Crandall paused near a cask smaller and stronger than the others in the room. It bore heavy bands of copper around its squat rotundity. Its chines were twice as thick as a man's palm, and its staves were hewed by hand. A hoary and ancient thing it was, as like a hunchbacked and wicked old man as any inanimate thing I'd ever seen. Crandall stooped with a cup to the spigot and drew a measure. In the lantern's glow it was like amber fire, all scintillating and alive with little lights of onyx and lapis lazuli. It glinted like the unlidded eye of a serpent, and for some unexplainable reason it fascinated us. It ran out of the spigot noiselessly and smoothly, as a serpent might glide to strike. We stood spellbound as we watched it, a liquid that actually seemed to live, possessing a mysterious something about it that sent a cold chill through me. Craig, the lawyer and the scoffer, took the cup when it was offered him by Crandall, and in an effort to be jocular, though I knew he did not feel that way, he proposed a toast. "Now, here's to death, the greatest joker of them all," he said, as he held the cup aloft. Then, gulping, as though he was seizing upon a poison potion, he tossed it down his throat. There was a tense moment. Then Craig laughed. "You ribald ass," he said to Crandall. "Why, you old skinflint, brought us down this dark passage, half scared us to death, just to give us a taste of a liquid as delectable as ever tempted the lips of man." Suddenly, in the meagre light, the laugh on his face froze to a grin, the grin that comes from a death's head. We stood, frozen with horror. His body appeared to lengthen into angularity. His neck became scrawny, his fingers like talons. His nose was pinched, and the skin drew taut as parchment, and the color of an old drumhead. His eyes blazed in the semi-darkness like coals of horrid, greenish fire. Suddenly, no hair was on his head. He was more bald than on the unfortunate day his mother bore him into this world. "You curs!" he howled. "You fiends of hell! What have you done to me?" His speech ended in a horrible gurgle in his throat. His talons went to his turkey-cocked neck. His eyes bulged from their sockets like a skull attempting to come to life. Blood-curdling, moaning sounds issued from his tightened lips. He turned upon us like a beast and struck out. We fell back before him, scattered like a pack of dogs when a hideous beast is at bay. His searching eyes espied a small axe near a cask, and this he seized and whirled above his head. "Seize him! Stop him!" roared Crandall, but before the words had penetrated our numbed brains, Craig had, with ferocious strength, thrown the axe from him and had dashed up the stairs. "Quick!" yelled Crandall. "Don't let him get away. He'll kill himself. Come on, let's go after him." 2. It seemed ages before we moved, our leaden feet heavy and ungovernable. When at last we did start headlong for the stairs, we fell in a heap in our eagerness to get out. Then, up the stairs and to the room that a few moments before had been so quiet and so comfortable, we ran. Now the sparks from the log fire were dancing helter-skelter in a gale that blew in at the open door. "After him! Quick!" commanded Crandall breathlessly. Following Crandall's lead, we leapt through the open doorway. The night was black. The sky was starless, and passing from the light, meagre as it had been, we could see nothing in the darkness. Batchelder tripped over something, fell heavily, and cursed. Stewart ran headlong into a tree and succumbed. I stepped off the porch and narrowly missed breaking a leg. But somewhere in the darkness, we could hear Crandall running and screaming, crashing through weeds and scrub which, in the passing of years, had overgrown the dooryard. We gathered ourselves up, and, keeping close together, we followed along the path Crandall had taken. Shortly, we heard him call at some distance from the house. I, the least winded of any, answered as loudly as I could, but it was a feeble shout, and I doubt if Crandall heard. As we staggered on in the darkness, we soon heard Crandall returning ahead of us. "Back to the house," he shouted, "and bring a light. Craig is gone. He's out there at the rocks. He's out at the Gayar tree. God!" Not understanding, we obeyed Crandall's command and turned back to the house where we could see the doorway outlined against the fire's dancing flames. Crandall overtook us, pushed by us, and hurried into the room. Before we were at the door, he was back again, this time with an electric torch whose glaring white rays were a relief to our sorely tried senses. Again we followed him, stumbling, panting, and driven onward by intuition of impending disaster. Through the weeds of the dooryard, over a rotting wooden fence, across a nearby meadow we plunged on. Up a steep knoll we toiled, and then into an ancient orchard where, in the light of the torch, old limbs gnarled and weather-beaten as a hermit's frame threatened us. We came into a bit of clearing that was apart from the rest of the orchard, where seemingly a tottering monarch had riven a space about him, beyond the charmed circle of which his subjects might not trespass. "Look," said Crandall, flashing the torch upward. "Gayar's got him. Gayar's done for him. Gayar's russet is his doom." As we gazed in awed silence, we beheld in the branches of that ancient apple tree a spectre that sent a chill through us. His distorted face grinned leeringly at us, the eyes open and bulging. It was Craig's face. His clothes flapped ghoulishly in the wind. His legs dangled tenuously and seemed to twist about each other. His taloned hands hung idly as a scarecrow's. But it was the manner in which he was suspended that set up the ache in our bones and made the sweat stand in great beads on our foreheads. For his turkey-cocked neck was caught in the crotch of one of the limbs a full 12 feet from the ground, and almost before our eyes the branch was closing in and around it, as though that gruesome head would be sheared from the cadaverous body. "Get back!" screamed Crandall suddenly. "Get back out of the clearing! Back!" Already stunned by the awful thing we saw before us, we were slow to heed Crandall's warning, and before any of us came to our senses, I felt a slimy thing grasp at my ankles. I looked down quickly, and all about me it seemed as if the roots of that old tree were alive, coming to the surface like the tentacles of an octopus to twine about our bodies, to crush us, to raise us to the position in which that thing that once had been Craig was lifted. I kicked and scuffed those terrible, twining, crawling roots. I sprang upward, only to come trampling down upon them. They seemed everywhere, squirming, running, working. I screamed aloud in my intensity to rid myself of them. Then, jumping, leaping, fighting, I somehow made the edge of the clearing into the beneficent haven of those other trees. One by one the others came, stumbling, tottering, falling beside me as I lay on the ground. How long it was we lay there, I do not know. Perhaps all of us fell into a comatose sleep, for when I at last roused myself, the dawn was breaking afar in the east, and I was half dead from cold. Near me was Batchelder, lifeless for all I could tell, until I noticed a slight rise and fall of his chest. Stuart was face downward, motionless, his face caked with dried blood from a cut on his scalp. Crandall lay wide-eyed, staring at nothing, with every muscle and every joint in my body aching. I slowly dragged myself over and shook them all. One by one, after repeated shakings, they also wakened. To all it must have seemed a hideous nightmare through which they had passed. None spoke for a time, each gazing at the other in mute questioning. I knew the thoughts that went through their minds, the attempt to recall where they were, what had happened, how they came to be in the condition in which they found themselves. At last, Crandall spoke. "Fiends of hell were in that cider. God, I never should have told him." He looked about him blankly. "But I wanted to see if the tale was true," he moaned, covering his face with his hands. God help me." Then it is not a dream?" Batchelder queried piteously. "Look for yourself," replied Crandall. There, in the grey light, we again saw the gnarled and twisted apple tree. The tenuous roots were gone, but still in the branches hung the thing that had once been poor Craig. If anything, that turkey-cock neck had grown longer by the weight of the body. An oath escaped Stuart's parched lips. "Let's get out of here," he muttered thickly. It was the fervent wish of us all, and acting in accord, we struggled to our feet and, haltingly, limpingly, staggered back to the house. The day was grey, and the wind cold and eerie. Crandall poked the embers of the fire, and stirred it into a desultory flame. He suggested a bit to eat, but none had a stomach for that. From somewhere he brought out a liquid that stung and burned and warmed us as it sent the blood into circulation again. "We've got to get Craig away," said Crandall at length. "Who'll help me?" Stuart and Batchelder were without the strength. It remained for me to go with Crandall. Securing an axe from a woodshed, we started out. We walked in silence for a few moments, but the headiness of the burning liquor Crandall had provided stimulated a question within me. "What's the meaning of it all, Crandall?" I asked after a while. "What was the stuff you gave Craig to drink?" "A hell's potion," he replied without turning his head, his gaze fixed steadily ahead toward the tree which we were nearing. Then he stopped suddenly. "I'm not so sure but that it will get me too," he muttered. "But you took none," I argued. "Why do you say that?" "Listen," he replied. "If Craig were alive with his legal reasoning, he would tell you I'm a murderer, though an unwitting one, and that if there is justice in this world, I should receive the penalty. There is a story behind it all, and this I must tell you, for I have a feeling that doom awaits me this day." He paused to wipe away the beads of perspiration that dampened his brow. His hand shook as though the cold wind had bitten him to the marrow. "This farm," he began as we walked on more slowly. belonged to an uncle of mine, and he was reputed to be the meanest, stingiest man in the state. Weird tales are told of him, how he robbed the poor, how he persecuted the widows who owed him money. So penurious was he that in his grasp for gold he is said to have opened graves by night that he might steal the keepsakes sacred to the dead. So he lived, grasping, wicked, a fiend of the devil. Then the story moves on. It was said that in his money-lending deals he secured the upper hand of a countryman who lived near here. Poor crops, illness, a dozen other circumstances that flocked to misfortune like buzzards to a feast caused this man extreme financial embarrassment. My uncle threatened to put him in jail as a defrauder unless he paid his loans. This the man was unable to do, but he had a daughter whose rare beauty caught my uncle's eye, and to the daughter my uncle appealed. He whispered in her ear that under certain conditions she might appease the debt. At first the daughter would not listen, but she loved her father, and my nefarious uncle pointed out to her that she would be a heroine. Driven to distraction for love of her father, the girl must have become insane. Anyway, at last she yielded, but did my uncle keep his promise to release her father from debt? He did not. Soon he had clapped the man into jail on a trumped-up charge that would not hold water in any court upon trial. But that did the daughter no good, for with her father away, she submitted to her despair, and eventually her body was found at the bottom of the chasm. Whether the weight of years upon my uncle had driven him like the beast he was to seek solitude when it came time for him to die, or whether he was stricken with remorse and was a suicide, is a matter of conjecture. One day he disappeared. No one knew whatever became of him. I was his sole heir, and since I had seen enough of the world through travel, I came to this farm as soon as the estate was settled. Here I have lived the same solitary life that my uncle lived, but heaven knows I never wronged woman or man until the night that has just passed. Crandall paused, again wiped the perspiration from his forehead, and after a moment attacked the trunk with the axe. It was difficult work, for applewood is hard and tough with a grain that twists and turns in amazingly fantastic ways. But this tree seemed tougher and harder and more twisted than any of its fellows. The corpse in its branches fluttered and swayed, a gruesome thing, as Crandall's blows fell upon the trunk. "Why do you cut the trunk of the tree?" I asked. "Why not cut the limb?" "It must be felled," he answered enigmatically. For a space he continued at work. He was a strong man and a skilled axeman, but he had laboured the better part of an hour before the trunk was more than 2/3 cut. Pausing to rest, he continued the narrative he had so abruptly concluded. "One day, while rummaging through my uncle's books," Crandall said, "I came across his diary. It was filled with the maunderings of what presumably was a diseased or at least a fanatical mind. Some of it was terrible enough, but it was the last entry that broke off without a definite termination that has burned into my brain. I have read it so often I can repeat it by rote. It said, 'The devil is in the russet apple tree in the north orchard. I have seen him today. He leered at me and beckoned to me. Sometime I will go to him, for the girl has cursed me. She cursed me the night before they found her body, as she came to this house. She said I had wronged her. Well, what if I have? What difference is that to me? But she said I was as crooked as the gay russet tree, and as hard and twisted. I laughed at her. She cursed me and said I was a devil, and that I should be a devil in a tree, and that whosoever drank of the fruit of that tree should be as mad as I." Crandall shivered. The wind was rising again, and although the morning was well advanced, the sky was overcast, and deep gloom seemed to settle over everything. The half-severed tree swayed in the wind. I've pondered much on that entry, and from other evidences I found about the house, Crandall continued, I became convinced that my uncle meant this particular tree, for it seems it is of a kind that was popular a generation ago, called Gayar's russet. Despite its remaining unpruned, it has borne wonderful russet apples, and from a crop of these 3 years ago, I had that cider made of which poor Craig drank last night. I had wanted someone to taste it to prove my theory concerning the warning of my uncle. I never had the nerve to taste it myself. Somehow I felt the disappearance of my grasping uncle and that tree were linked. I don't know what possessed me last night. I must have been mad myself when I enticed Craig into taking that liquor. You know the rest. I feel that I murdered Craig with that insane desire to test a theory. Crandall paused again. His back was to the tree as he faced me. Suddenly, there was a veritable hurricane of wind. The tree, beneath its impulse, swayed perilously, cracked, and before I could warn Crandall, it fell, crushing him to earth. One gigantic limb that seemed like a wildly waving arm pointed for a second to the sky, and as I stood rooted to the spot, it turned and struck me too. Again I lay unconscious. Again I roused myself to consciousness and looked about me. Crandall lay terribly crushed beneath the tangle of branches. Across him, with staring, gleeful eyes, was the thing that once was Craig. In the hollow of the tree's splintered stump was the skeleton of a bent and twisted old man. Terrified, I dragged my aching body away from the accursed spot. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,